अलीदाद शुरू हो गया हाँ आदाब welcome back to those of you who have been following this program of ours and to others who might not have seen some of the earlier following this series of webinars on Islam after colonialism by the University of Exeter Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and Habib University. I'm Nauman Naqvi and I teach in the Department of Comparative Liberal Studies at Habib. Allow me to begin with a brief introduction to the series and its trajectory up to now before I hand it over to my colleague, Professor Sajjad Rizvi from Exeter, to introduce our exciting speaker for today. We live in a global ruins today, introducing this theme. This may not be the way we would like to see our condition, but it is increasingly true of our experience and our reality. Not just in ecological ruins, but political ruins, social ruins, urban ruins, and rural ruins, ethical ruins, and cultural ruins. Among the forces responsible for this ruination was modern colonial rule, direct and indirect, which was qualitatively different from all imperialisms of the past. For example, here in South Asia, the East India Company was the first corporation in the history of the world, as is well known. So for the first time in history, corporate rule emerged, which completely transformed the nature and purpose of government. Another novel feature of modern colonial rule was its apartheid nature. Since with the emergence of national polities in Europe emerged white supremacism and racism. Thus, against the dynastic names of previous empires, say Timurid, Safavid, Ottoman, Gupta, Abbasid, etc., all names of families, as you know, you have national empires, British Empire, French Empire, etc. This novel modern apartheid feature was part and parcel of the new forms of knowledge and government developed and deployed by these modern apartheid empires. And alongside the radical transformation of the economy, thanks to unprecedented corporate capitalist rule, there was a radical transformation of culture, mentality, and society. Islam After Colonialism, our series, seeks to illuminate different aspects of these developments, both during colonialism and in its wake, after formal decolonization, in post-colonial nationalism that is intimately linked to its colonial forebear. After, however, also implies a before, so we have also looked at the pre-colonial past, which is also essential to the reparative part of the project, the healing part of this project. The third dimension is, of course, the future or a possible future, which as a question is also related to the present, what is to be done, to which our distinguished speaker today will speak directly in a futures past mode, the potentials of our modern history. So to recapitulate the series briefly, we began the series with Professor Faisal Devji, who spoke about the Khilafat movement and the new kind of politics that emerged in the wake of the First World War. Then Professor Shankar Nair spoke about the scene of Muslim Hindu scholarship in the 17th century. Professor Shanela Khoja Mulji spoke about decolonial praxis and contemporary education. Professor Nauman Beg spoke of retrieving cosmological understandings of the human in Sufism. Professor Sher Ali Tareen spoke of the emergence of a new kind of language of sectarian historicism in the late 19th century. And Professor Ibrahim Musa spoke about the need to repair madrasa education today. And with that brief introduction, I now invite my colleague, Professor Sajjad Rizvi from Exeter, to introduce our distinguished speaker for today.
Thank you, Nauman. That's a very useful recap. I guess you'll have to do the recap at the end of the year when we've had another 10 odd talks as well. Just to actually mention now, we will be resuming in the middle of January with another set of these seminars. And again, they'll be every 2 weeks. So from the middle of January, we're basically going to be running until late June. So there's still plenty to come. And so keep an eye out for the announcements for those talks. So today it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Layli Uddin, who is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. And she is very much a specialist on well, the list of areas she works on is quite extensive, as you'd expect. Leftist movements, radical thought, political thought, Islam, subaltern studies, and I guess this wider issue of the left in the world, and particularly in South Asia. And today she will in particular be talking about what she's calling Red Islam, the coming together of types of leftist thought, of Marxism and Islam, which has quite a venerable history in South Asia and of course across the world, certainly going back to the early 20th century, certainly after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia as well. I just thought I'd make one comment before I hand over to Layli, and that is to say that looking at Marxism is actually quite an interesting example to take, because it has this kind of double-faceted feature, and that sort of the two faces of it, famously were debated between Edward Said and Ijaz Ahmed a number of years ago. So on the one hand, Marxism, in a sense, comes in the wake of and is a result of colonial modernity. And at the same time, it's probably one of the earliest and interesting examples or phases of decolonial thinking in itself, right? So it has this kind of double-faceted feature, which is really interesting. So it will be interesting to see how the particular cases that arise out of South Asia help us make sense of that kind of paradox, and then also will help hopefully us to understand how that links in with other contexts, with Southeast Asia, with the wider sort of central lands, the Mashriq, as it's called in Arabic. Increasingly, I think the word Middle East is really not fit for purpose, but certainly those who are further west, for those who are in South Asia, in which you had similar kinds of experiences. So I won't say any more. I will just pass the mic to Dr. Layli Uddin, who will present her paper. So
Great.
Please, Layli.
Thanks. Thank you, Nauman and Sajjad, for inviting me. I really am delighted to be here. It's a privilege to be part of the series of talks that have taken place so far. What I'm going to be doing today is really talking about a larger body of work. It's part of a larger body of work that explores the making and unmaking of East Pakistan from the 1930s up to 71. My work seeks to go beyond a narrative that has framed the formation of Bangladesh as ultimately a triumph of secular Bengali nationalism over Muslim nationalism. In this view, Islam, which during the colonial years emerged as central sort of to the imagination of emancipatory political futures and brought heterogeneous communities together, becomes this exclusionary, prescriptive and violent force employed by the state or Islamist parties in the post-independence period. What I want to show in this paper, but also as part of the work that I've been doing, is how Islam continued to be a conduit for radical and progressive imaginaries and futures which were left unresolved after the formation of Pakistan in 1947, and then again unresolved by the birth of Bangladesh. So what my work does, in particular, at least, has been doing is I've been focusing on the political mobilization of poor peasants and urban workers and their relationship to the peasant and labor leader, politician, and unusually powerful Sufi saint, MAULANA BHASHANI, from his days in colonial Assam in the 1930s up to 71. So briefly, let me just say something about the historiography of Islamic socialism. Now, in the context of South Asia, it continues to be a small and relatively under-researched field compared to work in Iraq, Mashriq, and Southeast Asia. The focus has been overwhelmingly on figures and politics that emerged during the Khilafat movement. There's Humayun Ahmed's pioneering work on early Muslim socialists, which shows how they emerged out of this transnational convergence of pan-Islamism, Indian anti-colonial nationalism, and Bolshevism. But Islamic socialism there has been treated as this rather shallow political project that diminishes with the collapse of the Khilafat movement or morphs into these more or less secular projects, or absorbed into a larger sort of religio-political project out of political convenience, and ultimately suppressed after independence. Now, when it comes to sort of thinking about the intellectual history of Islamic socialism as well, I mean, here there's been a primacy of the legal discourse. So it's been treated as a legal project where members of the ulama debated on property, ownership, land redistribution, Islamic economics, according to the Quran and Hadith. You have Qasim Zaman in his work talking about sort of the work of the writings of Ubaidullah Sindhi and Maulana Popolzai, but he sort of dismissive about the grassroots activism that he calls of these figures. Now, if we were to sort of think about also scholars working on Marxist left politics in the Afro-Asian world, though there's a sort of a they're conscious of the heterogeneous forms of global Marxism, they've nonetheless focused on the agonistic politics between left and Islam and the vexed question of whether Muslims were ill-suited to Marxism or Marxism ill-suited to Muslim communities. Now, what I'm going to do with what I'm presenting today is I'm going to sort of build on Shahab Ahmad's argument that the history of Islam has been characterized by a range of hermeneutic approaches and trajectories. However, whilst Shahab sees these creative, exploratory, and contrary understandings and expressions sort of before the onset of European colonialism, what I'm going to suggest is that these creative hermeneutics continues in a significant way in the post-colonial period, particularly within the framework of a subaltern Islam. I will show how sort of Marxism, which is modern, in some ways, modern political thought, becomes part of this mystical, effective, and non-secular episteme. And the ways in which the figure that I've been looking at for the last 10 years, Maulana BHASHANI, reconceptualizes Islamic ideas of ummah, sacred geographies, the buyer, and networks of devotions, and uses them to advocate for third world solidarity, anti-imperialism, and vernacular socialism. What I'll do now is just share the screen. So let me just kind of offer a quick biography on BHASHANI before I start the paper. Born as Abdul Hamid Khan in 1885 to a rural family in colonial East Bengal, he died in 1976 in Bangladesh. BHASHANI's political career was an extraordinarily long one, outliving most of his contemporaries, Gandhi, Jinnah, Nehru, Bacha Khan, and Sheikh Mujib. His career spanned the colonial and the post-colonial period and intersected with networks and conversations from Cuba to China. Much of BHASHANI's time in politics was spent upsetting various ruling regimes. He's been colorfully characterized by his opponents over different periods as a demagogue by Isa, the Pakistani Dean of Canterbury, Ayatollah Kashani, Hanuman, Kafir, and the Prophet of Violence. Now, BHASHANI's familiarity and training in rural political conventions developed early on in life. As a teenager, BHASHANI was part of a folk theatre troupe enlisted for his skills in ribaldry and debating. However, before he could become a permanent member, BHASHANI was sent up to a madrasa by his uncle. His Islamic education matured in Assam, where he spent time as a murid to Pir Nasiruddin Baghdadi of the Qadri order, and then in Deoband from 1907 to 1909. BHASHANI spent only 2 years, never receiving his ijaza certificate. His followers nonetheless bestowed him with the honorific title of Maulana. Now, BHASHANI's prominence as a peasant leader, politician, and Sufi leader happens in colonial Assam, where it is here that he is given the other part of his name, BHASHANI, for his role in settling landless Bengali Muslim migrant peasants on the shores, the riverbank islands of Assam, and defending them against the claims that they were not sons of the soil and should be evicted. BHASHANI becomes the president of the Assam Provincial Muslim League and demanded Pakistan as part of a broader ethical discourse on Muslim belonging. After the creation of Pakistan, Bashani moved back to East Bengal and formed one of the first opposition parties to the Muslim League, the Awami League, which is the incumbent government in Bangladesh today, in 1957, who resigns from the Awami League and forms the National Awami Party, one of the first all-Pakistan parties after the Muslim League. NAP brought together veterans and leaders of anti-colonial movements, workers of the Communist Party, who were banned by the government in 1954, as well as Bashani's Murids from all provinces of Pakistan on a platform of anti-imperialism and social justice. Now, it's in the 1960s, however, that Bashani created new ways of bringing the left and the Muslim question together, producing powerful alliances and imaginaries around this project of a third world Islamic socialism. So let me sort of begin here. On the 17th of March, 1969, a Monday evening, a crowd gathered at a Maidan in Khairpur, Sindh, to hear the Amir of Jamaat-e-Islami, the main Islamist party in Pakistan, MAULANA Jan Muhammad Abbasi, deliver a speech against socialism. He had barely begun before the speech was interrupted by a stampede of cows. The crowd scattered, leaving behind shoes, hats, and other belongings. Whilst the crowd tripped, stumbled, and fell over each other, they shouted, "The socialists have come." In the midst of this mayhem, an electric bulb exploded, and the shouts mutated to "The Chinese have started bombing." Once peace was restored, the Amir resumed his address, but to a much smaller audience. A hopeless Amir said to his crowd, "Well, if the cows also turn socialists, what is there to do?" Now, the mirth and relish with which the socialist cows event was reported in the daily Shongbad was most likely done to highlight the silliness of the situation, and in particular the intellectual naivety of the Jamaat-e-Islami followers. However, what the article was in fact drawing attention to was this very palpable and powerful transformative and revolutionary political force that was coursing its way through Pakistan at that point in time. This was a politics that was trans-regional, Asiatic, but also local and subaltern, and it threatened to sweep away structures, existing structures, institutions, and values, and replace it with a world turned upside down. Over 1969 to 70, at the height of the popular uprisings in both wings of Pakistan that eventually toppled this decade-long dictatorship of Ayub Khan, the threat of China and socialism was represented in the single figure of Maulana Bashani. Now, Bashani's political activities in both wings of Pakistan in the 1960s were to strike a particular nerve with the opposition. When I'm talking about the opposition here, I mean the state as well as mainstream parties such as the Jamaat-e-Islami Party and the Awami League. Now, many of them had assumed that Bashani had fallen off the political map from early 1960s onwards, as he had withdrawn from political activities in the metropolitan centers of both wings. Yet, in December 1968, when President Ayub Khan arrived in East Pakistan, assured that he had taken care of the main sources of agitation in the province, with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the lead of the main opposition party in East Pakistan, in Dhaka Central Jail, and the schools and universities closed, trouble came from more unexpected causes. The response to Bashani's call for a province-wide strike and public disobedience was an overwhelming triumph, disrupting Ayub's visit and signaling the first phase of the uprising in East Pakistan. It appears that Bashani was not as politically inactive or weak as his opponents had assumed. Now, secondly, Bashani's mobilization of peasants and workers in both wings of Pakistan had a more radical and militant character over this period, with demands for workers and peasants to girao, purao, and jalao, surround and burn factories and farms. In East Pakistan, from the middle of February 1969, there was an escalation of news of violent deaths of moneylenders, village chairmen, and landlords in North Bengal. In the West Wing, Bashani, quoting Allama Iqbal, told peasants and workers to burn the land that did not feed them, to seize the mills and factories if a livable minimum wage was not provided, and to boycott elections if they did not receive a proportional share of seats in the political assemblies. And when we're talking about proportional share, he was talking about something from 75 to 90%. So finally, Bashani's politics also had a more defined objective during this period, the establishment of Islamic socialism. On 23rd to 25th of March 1970, Bashani organized the Toba Tek Singh Conference, one of the largest and significant gatherings of peasants, workers, students, intellectual poets, writers, artists, left activists in the history of Pakistan. MAULANA Bashani informed the crowd that Islamic socialism was the solution to their economic, social, and political sufferings. He proposed land redistribution and the nationalization of industries as key features of this project of Islamic socialism, on the basis that God was the owner of everything in the world. He demanded a popular referendum and threatened a guerrilla war if it didn't happen. Bashani's calls for Islamic socialism became more insistent in the peasant conferences that he held in East Pakistan, in places like Santosh, Mohipur, where the processions were more visibly and aesthetically socialist, with attendees wearing red caps, scarves, badges, waving red flags, and bamboo sticks. So why was Bashani's Islamic socialism so threatening to the state and other parties? Bashani's local politics, I suggest that the reason why it was so threatening was that Bashani's local politics connected to wider dynamic and insurgent geographies, communities, ideas, and politics, and Afro-Asian socialism, amplifying his power. Bashani, in a rally at March 1969, said, quote, "Our struggle is not simply to protect the interests of Pakistani peasants and workers. Our struggle is for the oppressed people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America." End quote. His domestic speeches of this period consisted of talking about these social, political, and economic conditions in the global South. He linked the struggles of farms and factories in these countries to the common enemy of imperialism, capitalism, and feudalism. Now, it was this double character in Bashani's Islamic socialism that threatened the Pakistan regime, who could not describe it entirely as a foreign, alien, or imported idea, or a narrow and provincial form of politics. Humaira Iqtidar notes the shift in the writings of Maulana Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi, the Jamaat-e-Islami leader, which prior to the 1960s was primarily focused on the issues of modernity, West, and colonialism, although he does talk about socialism as well. Now, the popular response to Bashani and Bhutto's Islamic socialism at home and the realization that Jamaat-e-Islami were losing the Islamic discourse to the left compelled Maududi to construct a critique of Islamic socialism, which actually Sayyid Wali Reza Nasser describes as an emotional one. He was only sort of interested really in the godlessness and critiquing the godlessness of Marxism. And what we see here on the screen is really the SHAUKAT-E-ISLAM rallies that organized by the Jamaat-e-Islami as a direct response to the Toba Tek Singh conference, and which had as its main slogan, "Death to Socialism." So Bashani's internationalist vision, rooted in subaltern solidarities, challenged the domestic nationalist discourses of the time. His sidelining of the nationalist space indicates that he did not see this as the most important or obvious venue for revolutionary politics or imagining revolutionary futures. Now, this move from the local to international politics might not seem unusual in the study of Muslim politics, where local religious leaders have, of course, drawn upon larger, effective conceptions of the Ummah. But what Bashani was doing was he was radically reconceptualizing the idea of the universal Muslim community, combining leftist internationalism of the time with the ideas of the Ummah. Bashani redraws and expands this feeling and experience of connectedness across geographic space to forge wider affinities and solidarities on grounds of radical justice. So how did Bashani come to develop his ideas of Islamic socialism? Now, of course, there's although the influence of Bashani's earlier trips to Europe, Egypt, and Syria in sort of the early to mid 1950s was clearly discernible in his anti-imperialist politics and visible in his demands for a non-aligned and independent foreign policy, nuclear disarmament, and world peace. The trip to China to celebrate the 24th anniversary celebrations had a profoundly transformative effect on him. In Mao Zedong DESHE, the only text that BHASHANI is known to have ever written, he described his trip as a defiant and incomparable experience, akin to going to Mecca itself. What we see up here is sort of an excerpt from the preface, where he talks about his friends being hurt from his travel by his travels to China, but he doesn't care. What he does is that he says, I went to visit that holy place. I did not fail in seeing it. After having experienced the rhythm of the new world, I've learned to see my scattered 80 years of life in a new way. There is no shame in my mind. So what is it? What was that new world that BHASHANI saw? What futures did he imagine during his trip? Now, using BHASHANI's text, pictures from a private collection, and Chinese newspapers, I argue that BHASHANI saw the possibilities of inhabiting an anti-hierarchical, anti-imperialist, and radically egalitarian Afro-Asian socialist world, where peasants and workers were elevated to positions of prominence. So on October the 1st, the main day of the celebrations in Tiananmen Square, you have Chairman Mao, Chen Yi, Chou Enlai were joined on the central rostrum by selected foreign guests, which included senior leaders of the Communist Party of Indonesia, who were later purged, Robert Franklin Williams, the civil rights activist and writer of the Negroes with Guns, founding text of the Black Panther Party. And you also had AMAR OUZEGANE, the Algerian Minister of State, and BHASHANI as well. Although it has not been possible to trace the conversations or the relationships that BHASHANI developed with people like Dean Aidit, Robert Williams, and other attendees, we can to a limited extent speculate on some of these conversations that were sparked between those encounters. Let's take AMAR OUZEGANE, who came from a family of Berber peasants, was a member of the Algerian Communist Party, worked for the National Liberation Front. In 1962, he had published his book, The Better Struggle, advocating the fusion of Islamist and socialist thinking, or in OUZEGANE's words, a synthesis between Islam and socialism in which the contradictions were pushed to the bottom. BHASHANI must have also found a lot in common with Robert Franklin Williams, who is described as a difficult man who cannot adjust himself to loving his enemies and is almost always vituperous and undiplomatic towards the political rulers. Robert Williams had also published his book in 1962, demanding Black militancy in the civil rights struggles. BHASHANI's encounter with socialist all hues must have made apparent to him the possibilities of inhabiting multiple identities, of being militantly Black and proud, or being a Muslim and socialist. Like Robert Williams, he must have also perceived the need for flexibility in the struggle for freedom, the flexibility to creatively work through images and politics of Muslim futures that were both radical, Islamic, and socialist. Now, the embodiment of this new world was further symbolized in BHASHANI's meeting with Puyi, the last emperor of China, and the then administrator at the Beijing Botanical Gardens. BHASHANI discussed with Puyi for 4.5 hours about his transition from an out-of-touch emperor, colluding with the Japanese, to a repentant, committed, and humble socialist and worker. So Puyi, when asked by BHASHANI about his life as a ruler, he goes, "You want to know about my life as a ruler? There's not much to tell. Those were the most wretched, the most unfortunate days of my life, filled with memories of my offenses against humanity. But today I can say with pride, I can say with joy that I'm a changed human being and that I've become a true citizen of China. This reformed life is a life of happiness. The earlier life was like a ghostly existence darkened by the curses of phantom souls," end quote. Now, although BHASHANI was familiar with stories of just and benevolent Muslim emperors and rulers in many Islamic fables and akhlaqi texts, these rulers were still quite unlike BHASHANI's real-life encounter with the emperor turned socialist and the redemptive powers of socialism. And this most likely helped to shape his ideas on the possibilities of radically redistributing power and authority. Finally, when it comes to sort of Bashani's trip, it was his interaction and observations of rural communism in China that left the most powerful and lasting impression on him. As Bashani toured across communes in China, he described how he found himself fascinated by the laughter of the Chinese peasants. Now, he was partially aware of the failure of People's Commune, but he was nonetheless impressed by the self-directed activities of Chinese peasants and the centrality and prominence that was given to rural life in communist China. Bashani ended his books on China on the same note that he had started it, as a transformed man. He had, in accordance with the sayings of the Prophet, gone as far as China in his quest for knowledge, and there he had found, in his words, the victory of the people. Now, Bashani's trip to China in some ways shares similarities to earlier travels of Sufi saints. Niall Green sort of writes about how Sufi saints in the early modern period were sanctifiers of routes opened up by merchants and soldiers. In many ways, Bashani's trip can be argued to be just that, Bashani helping to solidify new trade and diplomatic relations between Pakistan and China. But Bashani was doing more than that. He was reimagining sacred socialist geographies for his subaltern Muslim constituencies, where earlier Sufi saints had drawn together these distinct spaces on the basis of shared religious culture, tradition, and language. Bashani bound an atheist communist China and the holy city of Mecca in a sacred orbit on their effective and political experience of radical equality, where the emperor was indistinguishable from the worker and vice versa. Now, what I'll do is I'll sort of turn to Bashani's politics of Islamic socialism at home. Now, he returns back to sort of Pakistan after China, and it's marked by what appeared to be a retreat from public visibility. In 1965, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the leader of the Awami League, accuses him of being a collaborator to the Ayub Khan regime. But different archives indicate that in this period, that Bashani was stealthily organizing and mobilizing the peasantry of North Bengal, as well as labor constituencies elsewhere. Bashani engaged in several innovative practices that were intended to organize and mobilize his constituent groups to bring about a form of Islamic socialism, or at least prepare the way for it. So what he does, one of the sort of the first things that he does is that he introduces these new relationships and linkages, brokering the most unlikely of alliances between Bashani's murids, the disciples and the Marxist workers of NAP, legitimating the existence of the other in one another's world. Now, this was done through changes, if not a complete innovation, that Baya introduced in his relationship with his murids, particularly in the Baya that we see on screen here, the oath of allegiance over this period. Now, the Baya, which has been administered over centuries, has usually happened through a hand clasp or by touching the peer's unraveled turban, and it's one of the fundamental gatekeeping ritual of initiation. So once a rule set by the Sufi master has been accepted, the disciple was formally initiated into the brotherhood and given access to the master's special knowledge of God. Now, keeping with tradition, Bashani offered his murids his own distinctive brand of drawing closer to God. The Baya, now printed in a check-like format with a counterfoil of the murid's oath alongside his signature, demanded alongside the usual articles of belief in God, Prophet, and the spiritual lineage, and belief in socialism. So the Baya stated there is only one path to the freedom of all people from all forms of oppression, socialism. So this is what there are different versions of the Baya. So I'm reading out what I'll do. Actually, I won't read out the version of the Baya that I've got. If you just read on the one on the screen. So what with the Marxist workers of NAP and the Krishok Shomiti, this is the Peasants Association, more frequently present at religious gatherings and mosques, the murid was to find his world equally transformed as well during this period. With belief in socialism now naturalized into an article of faith, the murid's search for that deeper connection with Bashani and God was to be found in his engagement with the external world of political activism as much as the internal world of chants and meditation. Burhanuddin, a murid and peasant cultivator from Tung-ER, in the course of performing his spiritual duties, did not only become a firm advocate of anti-imperialism, he was arrested over five times for his Krishok-Shamiti activities during this period. The peasants, whether recruited as murids or by Marxist workers, were to find their different pledges had an equal bind, both in terms of content and form. It was no coincidence that the buyer had resembled the subscription form of the Krishok-Shamiti. The representation of the buyer in this very modern and secular form was intended to give it the same weight of authority that other paper transactions had come to acquire in the life of the peasant. However, amongst the few written documents that a peasant was to accumulate in his life, the buyer stood as the reminder of what was needed for a freer, more fulfilling spiritual and material existence. Drawing from authority from both the material and spiritual registers, this was intended to be a piece of paper more powerful than any other, one that promised the destruction of the hated papers of the moneylender, the landlord, and tax records. The second intervention that BHASHANI made was his introduction of new ideas, languages, and vocabularies in assemblies and gatherings, which was intended to impart to the peasant workers a sense of their own power and dynamism. BHASHANI introduced to his constituents to their new selves over this period. They were the Shorbahara, the have-nots. Now, the Shorbahara itself was not a new term. It's regularly used in the Marxist lexicon to refer to the proletariat class. BHASHANI, however, opened it to incorporate wider and different histories, futures, and icons, both sacred and profane. Again, this can be seen as a reworking of the Ummah. The Shorbahara for him constituted a class that was not defined by what they lacked, but by their ubiquitous presence across different times, geographies, and civilizations, possessing the power to change the course of history. BHASHANI, at a public rally in Pabna in East Bengal in 1964, clearly defined who the Shorbahara were. He said that theirs was a rich lineage, from the Bani Israelis in ancient Egypt to the followers of Prophet Saleh in the land of Thamud, people who had battled the class of big people who had appropriated arable land and conquered and conspired to take people's livelihood from them. But it was not just in religious times that the Shorbahara were to be found. They were the Sicilian slaves who revolted against the Roman Empire. They were the Russian, European, and Asian peasants and workers of the modern age. He argued that their more immediate ancestors had fought against the Hindu zamindars and the Muslim badshahs in the Wahhabi, Farezi, Indigo, Nankar, and Tabaga movements. As he concluded his history lesson, BHASHANI explained the value of it to the peasants. He said, "You are not weak as you think you are. Actually, you're not weak at all. In the face of your united strength, any government, however powerful it is obliged to bow its head." Now, the easy argument here is that the BHASHANI's innovations of the Baya and Shorbahara was a clever sort of mobilization tactic for bringing these very two incomparable, disparate and discrete sort of worlds together. But I think what BHASHANI is doing, or at least what I'm trying to argue, is that he makes a far more interesting and radical intervention in the world of Islam and Marxism. The bureaucratization of the Baya appears to speak to the triumph of the print over the oral, the rational over the irrational, and science over the spiritual. BHASHANI, though, through his charismatic authority, was doing the opposite. He was turning the idea of paper against itself by investing it with spiritual authority. BHASHANI shows that print does not demystify or desacralize Islam. BHASHANI used the obsession with logic, science, and development to point out what is being lost in Islam and Marxism, the spiritual and emotional appeal of emancipation. Now, BHASHANI's project of Islamic socialism brought together Karachi dock workers, Punjabi tenants, North Bengal sharecroppers and industrial workers in the outskirts of Dhaka, urban intellectual left workers and religious minorities in both rings. BHASHANI framed Islamic socialism using folk and Islamic concepts that people could understand and connect to without threatening their sense of their moral selves. On 9th of March 1969, the uprising in East Pakistan, where the uprising in Pakistan reached its climax, Ayub Khan would write in his diary, "Gangs of communists and terrorists, on the prompting of BHASHANI, are raiding police stations. the houses and properties of Muslim leaders and asking the chairman and members of basic Democrats to resign. In consequence, most of the civil officers have left their posts, and so have the local rent collectors, and their records have been burnt. These communists and terrorists that compelled the dictator of Pakistan to resign were not just students or the middle class, but peasants and workers as well. So let's just sort of move to the conclusion. What the figure of BHASHANI is doing is that it's telling a different and a lost sort of story of Islamic socialism in South Asia, which has sort of up till now been submerged in the history of making and unmaking of nations. BHASHANI's travels to China in the 1960s, a counterpoint to earlier direction of Sufi movement, shows us how religion and peasant internationalism came together in this inter-Asian context to produce a third world project of Islamic socialism. But what I've also tried to show here is how Islamic knowledge and authority was constituted in subaltern communities. It's in the act of political mobilization, in the act of social movements, that Islamic and Marxist ideas take on more creative, exploratory, and contrary forms. So what remains of this project of a third world Islamic socialism in South Asia? Now, BHASHANI is dead, and the nation state is resilient, brutal, and the Asiatic encounters have changed. But the dream images of that particular epoch, as used by Walter Benjamin to talk about revolutionary possibilities of the present, can still be found. They are in the huts and homes of poor villagers. They're of poor villagers and charred dwellers in Bangladesh, Assam, and Pakistan, who dream of BHASHANI flying to them on boats pulled by tigers to tell them what their next andolan or struggle is. It's or as they protest against power plants and river erosion. It's in the left circles and working class Muslim diasporas looking for their DESHE Malcolm X. It's in the clandestine and official archives which are being destroyed. These are the spaces where the spectre of third world Islamic socialism lingers. Thank you.
Wow, what a fantastic journey, huh? And what an extraordinary, fantastic, charismatic figure that you've been reviving for us, making alive again for us through your work, Layli. I myself also, of course, lived through these years. I was I was just a child, but my father, when I grew up, amongst his favorite, as I was telling you earlier, among his favorite political figures in our region, MAULANA BHASHANI must be the one that he admired. He himself is a kind of Marxist, atheist, liberal socialist. It was BHASHANI on the one hand and Frontier Gandhi, Bacha Khan on the other. I'd like you to perhaps say something about the comparison between those two figures, perhaps. But the first question I have, he's just such an extraordinary figure. It is just sheer luck, you could say, that somebody like him was possible. One wishes he was around today, but is such a figure again? I've been thinking about the fact that there were these remarkable figures during this time period, all over the world, in Africa, as you know, also in North America. You mentioned some of them in North America, and here in South Asia too, of course, BHASHANI being one of them. But it seems that that entire possibility has vanished. Yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that we simply don't have any figures of that stature, of that moral stature, also in terms of vision, charisma. Something has happened which it's a dark, world that we live in. It's a dark moment in history. But it seems to me that something has happened that has made leadership of this quality or human beings of this quality kind of virtually impossible today. Well, at least you can't see figures like that on the scene. I mean, so that's one of my questions. Of course, your talk is so productive. There are many things to talk about. I mean, in terms of internationalism, for instance, to talk about the difficulties of our moment, is an internationalism like that? I mean, I think that's one of the most appealing aspects of his program, and it is the most relevant to our times, even if it's hardly anybody's talking about it. Unfortunately, is an internationalism like that possible today? And then, of course, China. Yeah. So, I mean, while you were describing his experience of China, I was on the one hand reminded of, in that book that you cited by Humayun Ansari, some of the experiences that these early Maulanas who went in the early 20th century, the kind of impact that seeing the Soviet Union, we're talking, very early, like in 1919, 1920, I think. It had the same kind of impact on them that China obviously had on Maulana BHASHANI. So I was on the one hand reminded of that, but on the other hand, I was thinking naturally of what China has become, what China is today, which is, to my mind, really monstrous. I mean, there's a genocide happening. Everybody in the world knows about it, even if the Muslim countries, of course, including Pakistan, have sided with China on this. And it's just a really brutal order. What came of these revolutions, and what's that about? So how do we think about that today? So those are some of my questions. Thank you so much for that very exciting talk. Yeah, thrilling, really.
Should I answer these? Okay, great. So, I mean, but sort of the relationship between BHASHANI and Bacha Khan, I mean, it's there in terms of we have. So in terms of NAP itself and with the formation of NAP, Bacha Khan is very much prominent in that sort of, in how sort of in NAP, the National Awami Party comes together. He was there for the founding of the party. He is the sort of the chair of the West Pakistan National Awami Party at that point. What we see also is, in some ways, I don't actually, in terms of, I've yet to excavate that relationship, other than to know that there was a relationship and there were conversations happening. If we look at BHASHANI's Ursus today, you have a group called the Khudai Khidmatgars, who are there, who are present, and in that Urs, and so there is a relation in terms of the work that BHASHANI's Murids are doing, but also Bacha Khan's Khudai Khidmatgars are doing, or the sort of the motivations that are sort of impelling them to work in a particular sort of for, whether it's for social justice, dignity, I mean, are pretty similar. So I think there is a convergence, but in some ways, Bacha Khan never really articulates this idea of Islamic socialism. In fact, he is slightly sort of withdrawn or reticent about it. You don't really hear, unless the sort of in terms of the work that I'm seeing, it's not there. Whereas BHASHANI is quite vocal. It appears to be, and he is sort of aligning himself with a tradition of people like Azad Khan Subhani. He's talking about sort of Maulana Maniruzzaman Islamabadi, and he's talking about a Hukumat Rabbaniya, which I don't know if Bacha Khan is doing itself. So I think there are similarities in how they're sort of in terms of sort of tactics and mobilizations of a particular constituency, because they're working with similar constituencies, and there's coherence in ideas, but there's also departures that we see in that idea, and perhaps that explains Wali Khan's sort of departure from, when sort of NAP splits into sort of NAP Wali Khan and NAP BHASHANI. But I think there's interesting things to come out of this relationship, but I don't really know much about that relationship. Now, as a historian, I'm always a bit sort of reluctant to talk about sort of the present itself and whether, and so, is such a figure possible? I mean, I think the sort of the historical conditions are different, right? So my sort of work on, I think the historical conditions are different. The economy, the political economy is different itself as well, and and sort of the state in itself, the nation state, or at least is different in how it sort of functions or how it sort of deals with how it relates to citizens. I think we see resemblances to BHASHANI appearing, sort of, you see it in the present day, you see a sort of a reverence for BHASHANI in certain groups and within left groups that you would expect. So it's not that the left have completely moved away from BHASHANI. Even today, if you think about in Pakistan or sort of Bangladesh, there is a conversation. In fact, there is a conversation around BHASHANI. There is a revival of BHASHANI that I'm seeing in sort of in present day conversations. So there is an interest in how BHASHANI is bringing together these ideas of Islam and Marxism, which is not seen in any way as something that's incompatible, right? So in some ways, these ideas still talk to sort of these very different economic conditions and historical sort of and different political conditions. So I don't actually know the answer to that question of whether such a figure is possible. I think we see resemblances. I think but it's not something that I can answer. It's not something that I'm sort of that I yet know much about. Now, in terms of China and sort of when BHASHANI visits in 1963, I mean, there's already, you can see the failures of the communes. There's already, I mean, there's various things there's a mass hunger, there's a sort of, and people dying. So BHASHANI is partially aware of these failures that are happening in China, but he's also trying to take from it what he sees, right? He's seeing this sort of this dignity that's given, or at least an elevation of certain constituencies to the forefront, right? There's this elevation of this dignity that's being afforded to peasants, and where they're taking charge of factories, or where they're sort of taking charge of farms, and this collectivization. And sort of given that South Asia, at least Pakistan, East Pakistan, is in this state of sort of a perpetual famine. With partition, it's not a famine, but there's a near sort of famine all the time. If you look at official reports, you see a near famine. So when he goes to China, he's very impressed with what, like sort of the at least with what he sees in the communes. And these spaces, I mean, what sort of, and BHASHANI is not the only one to be impressed, right? You have Robert Franklin Williams that I'm talking about. You have the Indonesian communist leaders coming to these celebrations, and you're having various, so BHASHANI is not the only one who's thinking about this sort of internationalism, whether it's with China, whether it's with Cuba, but in some sense, it's also, I don't know whether you can see something, whether there is something like China or Cuba this very day, whether if you go in the present moment, where is that space now that affords you to think about sort of material, of social justice, of where is that where is that country now where you would go to? It's certainly not China. If you go to China, you're not going to see that space. It's certainly not, perhaps maybe Cuba, but I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, where is that space that people can look to? And I think there is a sort of a despair. There is a despair of the present moment that we, of something, there is a sort of a loss that we should acknowledge, that we've lost spaces of these of internationalism.
Shall I take off?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, perhaps the big thing which has happened is the eclipse of the left, right? So I mean, that's everywhere. You know, the idea that the left would constitute some sort of ideal or a set of practices, ideas, I just don't think is even viable for most people. And insofar as the left really seems to have only retreated into a certain set of elite, rather philosophically verified debates. You know, so where do you find the left? You find it in like these little tomes written by, you know, Naqvi and people like that. So that's obviously the big difference, and that relates to one of the themes which struck me when you were speaking and looking across the board. There seems to have been, certainly in South Asia, and this I think is true in other places as well, a basic tension between what you might call kind of elite Muslim socialist formations, right? So elite, by that I mean kind of aristocratic, semi-aristocratic, even clerical. Forms, you know, like for example, Humayun's book, as we talked about, you know, that's a classic example of that. And then those which are much more popular, so you know, the kind of the whole Mazdoor Kisan kind of form of socialism, and so the dichotomy there seems to have been an issue, and you know, what sort of figure, what sort of ideas can actually link those two types of socialism, I think is a very important question. And then related to that, I think is this thing that if one's talking about Islamic socialism as the coming together or the productive merger of two concepts, then its value and its attraction cannot purely be abstract, right? So obviously when BHASHANI and others are talking about Islamic socialism in other contexts in Iran, the same sort of thing, they're not just appealing to very abstract ideas. They're talking about very specific things. So, you know, if you could say a bit more about the actual appeals, you gave some indications when you were talking about the uses of Sufism, right? So maybe if you could say a bit more of that, you know, when he's talking about Islamic socialism and people are listening to him, say at a rally or whatever, what are the particular things which he's hooking them with? You know, what sort of what are the specific symbols or ideas or things that he can point to, which make people think, oh yes, this actually is possible. This is a possibility.
In term, I mean, I think you're right that there has been an eclipse of the left, and that is not necessarily due to simply the failings of the left, right? We are dealing with a much more sort of we're dealing with different kinds of nation states that have now they're more seasoned, right? They know how to control, they know how to discipline a lot better, where the sort of the earlier, when we're looking at the 50s and 60s, you see those tactics have sort of disciplining have developed over time, and the economies have changed as well. So, I mean, it's not that the left has failed in some ways, and it's retreated to, you're right, into these very these theoretical sort of abstractions and their tones and to the urban areas. Actually, in some ways, the left, at least when I think about it in terms of what's happening in Bangladesh, has moved away from the rural spaces. So what was BHASHANI's spaces before have now been taken over by sort of parties like the Jamaat-e-Islami with their sort of, you know, and they in some ways mimic the sort of rhetoric of what BHASHANI used to, sort of, you know, the welfareist sort of element of it. And why the left is unable to do that is also to do with the failure of being able to speak in a particular language, that those effective tones, that sort of the language that BHASHANI used, of the ways that he thought about God. So BHASHANI talks about God as, so he creates, I mean, so BHASHANI articulates this idea, at least he does this speech in 74 where he calls it Palonbad. Palonbad is, in some ways, his ideas of Hukumat al-Rabbaniya, where he talks about his sort of conception of God and his conception of the universe and the sort of the role of the people. And in some ways, it's not particularly sort of original or mind-blowing, but he talks about sort of the difference between, so, and this is where I think, trying to link the sort of the question to link the first to the last as to how did Bashani speak to them. So he talks about God in terms of someone who does lalon palon. Now, lalon is to cherish, to nourish, and to protect. So there's this idea of God as a sort of, who's nourishing and creating and who's constantly building. So he does this thing, who's constantly in transformation and constantly sort of building. And so, and this is where, and so then, Bashani talks about how that is the responsibility of the people. The people are there as God's representatives, and they're there to do the same things. They're there to cherish, nourish, and they're there to take responsibility. They're there to protect what he has given them, whether that's in terms of nature and communities. And there is no distinction when he talks about people as to whether there's no distinction of in terms of religion or in terms of, everyone has that responsibility of sort of nourishment and protection and sort of cherishing. And so this idea also that God is the owner of everything. You have a right to something, but you don't have a right to own something. So, right, he's talking about ownership is such like Bashani in some ways does something that's quite particular. He talks in a very, in some ways, he talks about the material conditions of people using a very sort of using religious language. He talks about them, ideas of ownership, right? Who owns the land, who doesn't, through the fact that God is the owner of everything, and you have a right to property, but you don't have a right to own it, and you don't have a right to own something that you are not working on. So there's that, and I've spoken about the buyer, right? The buyer that he introduces. Now, what I've shown you was something 60,000 of these were apparently produced as to, and when I saw the those who signed, so it's usually the sort of the checkbook that I saw had women signing up to it who were in the borders of Bengal. So, there's Bashani's using very, in some ways, very sort of he's sort of using very material, he's bringing in the language of the political economy, or he's bringing in sort of, he's taking into sort of consideration the social material conditions, the very concrete social material conditions, and he's using it, and he's bringing in conceptions of God, conceptions of sort of worship into it, so I don't really have a coherent sort of answer for that, but I did want to answer the sort of the elite Muslim socialists and the sort of where you said, where's that bridge between, and that's where, the bridge in some ways in my work was Bashani, right? So Bashani is used in some ways by the left, right? Their sort of their inability to speak in a particular language is where Bashani comes in. So they, there's this, Bashani sort of uses, Bashani is able to go into spaces, whether it's to mosques, whether it's to shrines, whether it's to, and also use particular strategies. So Bashani is using, when he's opening up sort of, a protest, he's praying, right? And he's sort of when he's sort of defying the state, the section has the state has placed section 144, which is prohibiting public assemblies. What he'll do is he'll lay down his prayer mat there in a particular space, and he'll start praying. And what he'll do is he'll gather a large, and in some senses what he's doing is he's getting around these very secular laws of the state through very religious means. He's sort of and so that's so Bashani in some ways is sort of looking at the concrete ways, whereas the elite Muslims are thinking about the sort of how can we, in a more theoretical way, right? Where does how can we think about the Quran and the Hadith in these, in sort of in ways of bridging it, sort of, and bridging that with Marxism? Bashani is thinking of it in a very concrete way. How do I speak about socialism, but in a prayer meeting, or how do I think about it in in shrines and stuff?
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Sure.
So, it's very interesting. Of course, this is a major sort of cognitive difficulty amongst the major cognitive difficulties, I would say, that plagues the left today. The question of religion. I mean, it seems to their quote unquote secularism seems to have become much more entrenched, in fact, than it was in the generation that you're talking about. The early 20th century and the first quarter of the 20th century. The left, I think, was much more flexible, actually, in this regard. You can see moments of that even in somebody like Faiz Ahmad Faiz's poetry. So, I mean, even if they were atheists, they understood that they were Muslim atheists. And what has happened, I mean, and I think to talk about, of course, one is not just blaming the left, it's the environment which the left finds itself in. The concept of deity, divinity that you were just talking about has been really dramatically transformed over this time period. I mean, somebody was in that anthology that Gyan Pandey edited, Hindus and Others. There was this fabulous essay charting how the deity of Ram had been utterly transformed over the course of the 20th century. Really, I mean, one could say the same about Allah. I mean, the Allah that you're talking about, of course, it starts out with Rahman and Rahim. These are obviously the most important qualities of God. In fact, you cannot imagine divinity without it. It's a Rabbul Alameen. That's what makes God Rabbul Alameen, is the fact that he's Rahman and Rahim. There's a direct relation. So over this time period, he's become Rabbul Muslimin. I mean, in Malaysia, they've even banned non-Muslims from saying Allah, saying that Allah is the God of the Muslims. So there's this very, very dramatic. I mean, it's basically kind of like the nationalization of deities. The nationalization of God, the nationalization of divinity. So yes, and the two kind of go together. I mean, on the one hand, there is this nationalization of divinity happening, which obviously leads us to the other limitation on the left today, in such dramatic contrast with somebody like MAULANA BHASHANI, is I mean, it seems nationalism is everywhere. This is why, a large proportion of the left could support Brexit, a totally reactionary, right-wing fascist movement. And, there are other examples to give, of course. Plenty of examples, unfortunately, to give today. So internationalism, that's the other major, the more entrenched, as you were saying, the maturation of the nation state, has meant that the very possibilities of imagining a world outside, nationalism, just as, I mean, of course, it's the most extreme on the right and with the resurgence of fascism, but it exists on the left too.
I agree. I think the problem of nationalism, or the nation state itself, is one of the key failures around Islamic socialism, or at least the third world project of Islamic socialism. I mean, and this is where, Bashani himself is trying to think beyond the nation states. He sees the sort of the sphere, and he's in some ways, whilst he's he recognizes his space, that he is within a territorially bounded place is also not, but he's not limited by it, right? He's talking about Afro-Asian socialism. He's also, I mean, it's interesting, and also what I mean, I think what's interesting is how his followers see him. So when his murid dreams that he's flying, sort of he's flying across boundaries, right? To arrive to him. He's flying across sort of with, I mean, he's flying on a boat with pulled by tigers to visit him and tell him about this dream of where the Syrian, the dream that he grants. So Bashani gives him two messages, one of it American imperialism in Syria ending, and the other one, the next struggle is on fuel. So Bashani, I think what Bashani does in sort of in the 50s and 60s is that he continues to believe in a much more on a sort of that the nation state was not inevitable, right? And this is apparent in it, and I think that is no longer the case. We can't see beyond the nation state, whether as in terms of the left or in terms of sort of Islam itself. And I think that's one of the key questions. Where do we see, how do we sort of now think about internationalism? Where are those spaces of socialist? Are there spaces of socialist internationalism? And where might there be, or what other forms of internationalism can take place? I think that's something to think about.
I mean, there are a couple of questions in the chat. One is actually very specific, but I'm not going to ask you this necessarily because it could become very precise. This is about this whole question of the relationship between Mujib and BHASHANI. And the accusation of collaboration. But I guess my wider question is, to what extent do basically Mujib and then to a certain extent even Bhutto kind of steal BHASHANI's stuff, right? So, in the 70s, the People's Party then kind of embraces Islamic socialism in Pakistan. Yeah. And it seems as if that space is now gone because it's been taken over, and then it's gradually kind of neoliberalized. Yeah. But in the first instance, it's just like taken over. And you find that happening, I think, in other contexts as well, where you have this kind of repackaging, appropriation repackaging of Islamic socialism happening by other parties who are not really committed to it at all.
Yeah.
I
mean, I think you're right. If you speak to, I think when it comes to Bhutto, in terms of my conversations or interviews with other people, there is this idea that Bhutto sort of jumps on this bandwagon, which is, and he sees the wheels are turning, right? And sort of this roti kapra makan doesn't necessarily come from him, but from sort of, it comes from the politics of the National Awami Party, and that who had been consistently speaking of those things. But there are within, at least within the People's Party, you had people like Hanif Rame, who is thinking quite, at least thinking quite deeply. He's producing texts on Islamic, Islamic socialism. There is a sort of a flurry with, at least with the People's Party, you do see a flurry of print and at least conversations around Islamic socialism. But you're right of the appropriation, right? It's in some ways it becomes this very, whilst Bashani used it as a political vehicle as well. It's a political vehicle, is a way, he was, but I think there was I think Bhutto and them were much more strategic. In some ways, they were much more strategic political players than Bashani and Nap. And at that point, Nap was also disintegrating simply because, there's also a fight as to which way do we turn, with China or Moscow, and these were not sort of conversations that Bashani was interested in per se. It's the left who are interested. It's the leftists within sort of NAP who are interested in whether they go towards China or Moscow, or as to what sort of relationship they should have with the People's Party or with Awami League. Mujib also does that. I mean, in some ways, the 6 points has nothing to do with socialism. If we think about it, it's emancipatory in a different way. I mean, it's really talking about autonomy, but not necessarily emancipation of another, and so, and particularly, but and the idea, the socialism in sort of Mujib's politics comes later, and it comes within sort of the 70s, and you see them entering into the Awami League, also enters into sort of union politics, labor unions, and struggles much later. They're quite absent in earlier sort of, whether in sort of in agrarian spaces, at least before then. In fact, there's very little. If you look at the conversations in the archives, you see Awami League people saying that there's really no interest in the agrarian space as such. The urban is where the politics is to be decided. And perhaps that's where BHASHANI falls apart, in the sense that he doesn't take so much of an interest in the urban as he does in the rural. So whilst he's sort of, if you look at the 1969 politics, the more radical militant spaces in sort of is really in the agrarian spaces of Bengal, where BHASHANI is, but that militancy is stopped when it comes to the urban spaces, like the urban. So I think it's the failure to sort of to realize that the urban in the post-colonial period, the urban is the place that holds political capital. And yeah, so that's
yeah, because of obviously the development of the political economy, of course.
Yeah.
There is a question about Ubaidullah Sindhi and the comparison, which I think is an interesting one. I mean, let me put the question to you in this way. It strikes me that you can look at all of these figures, BHASHANI, Sindhi, etc., as being, I guess, within the context of what has been called, a bit reluctant to use it, but has been called kind of Muslim cosmopolitanism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have these kind of figures of, throughout the 19th and 20th century who are considered to be cosmopolitan figures because they straddle different types of communities. They're very international. They're moving, between South Asia and other parts. But that cosmopolitanism at some point takes on more of a leftist kind of hue. I think that's primarily 1917. Yeah, maybe if you could kind of wonder, how does cosmopolitanism play? Does it play a role in BHASHANI's thought? And maybe you could reflect a bit on the relationship between him and Ubaidullah Sindhi.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the cosmopolitanism, and there's cosmopolitanism versus internationalism, or which has, with the cosmopolitanism, I wouldn't say there's an absence of politics. It's a different kind of politics that's happening in cosmopolitanism, and I think internationalism speaks to a much more politics which is based on material and social sort of struggles. So BHASHANI, BHASHANI is cosmopolitan, and it depends on what, we'd have to sort of argue about, we'd have to sort of debate as to what cosmopolitanism is here and internationalism is here. But I think BHASHANI is cosmopolitanism in the sense that his networks go beyond his particular, the space within which he operates. They're international in some sense. They go to, there's the China, but then he's going to Cuba, the Tricontinental Conference, is building sort of relationships with Samir Amin and, Jacques Verger, and he's, but there's, I think there's also, whereas with, I know Seema Alavi talks about it in her work, this Muslim cosmopolitanism, but I think there's a politics that's lacking within that, and I think that's something that we have to take into consideration now. With the Ubaidullah Sindhi, and in terms of MAULANA BHASHANI claims to have met Ubaidullah Sindhi, although this is, we're not sure if that's really the case at all, but there is a relationship there. I mean, Ubaidullah Sindhi in some ways is sort of, they're both from Deoband. They're both Deobandi figures. I think they would, I'm not sure if they were there at the same time. Bashani's there for 2 years, 1907 to 1909, but he claims, and I think they're affected by, in terms of they're sharing the same experience, right? They're sharing the political experience, I think. And I think there's a relationship to Shah Waliullah as well. I can see a question around Shah Waliullah because Bashani is also sort of, to a certain degree, talks about being influenced by Shah Waliullah's politics. And there's a particular sort of phrase that Bashani attaches to Shah Waliullah, which is, I think, where Shah Waliullah says something around destroying everything. I've forgotten what it is in Arabic, but that it's at least one that he attributes to Shah Waliullah, where Shah Wali talks about this sort of the destruction of institutions, or to create the world anew. Sajjad, you're looking quizzical, but it's possible. I mean, there is a relation there's a relationship there. I don't know much about it, but I do know that when at least the Khalifa of Bashani, when he's talking about it, attributes a sort of Bashani, Bashani being influenced by the political philosophy of Shah Waliullah and Ubaidullah Sindhi as well, and being part of this network of people.
It might have something to do with the sort of regional limitations to some extent in terms of the relations. But I wanted to suggest that one might call it cosmologicalism, referring to one of the earlier talks, because he is, after all, engaged in a reflection on God. So more than a cosmopolitanism or internationalism, it's a kind of cosmologicalism, which I think is what we need today.
Yeah, no, I think there's an interesting conception of, I mean, there really is a reconceptualization. At least Bashani feels like he's reconceptualizing God, but he's also part of a network that's sort of thinking of a different vocabulary for God, right? It's and in some ways not as and so he's attributing them to a certain group of people. So I think Abul Hashim is the other person that, I mean, so Abul Hashim writes a book around sort of a text around Islamic socialism. Maulana Azad Subhani is also talking about Islamic socialism. He's going to New York, and he's Azad Subhani is going to New York, and he's addressing sort of Harlem, and he's going to Jackson Heights and talking about Islamic socialism. So Bashani, and they're sort of, and in that sort of talk about socialism, I think the idea of who God is, or what, or sort of is quite distinct, right? So it's a sort of God is much not as I mean, in some ways a benevolent figure, but appears benevolent, but in some ways, I think it's a sort of, it's this idea of cherishing that sort of cherishing what God has created. God as a cherisher, God cherishing what God has created, and that it means everything. It's in some ways indiscriminate. It's and that seems to be apparent in sort of the things that I'm reading around what Bashani is saying about Islamic socialism. So perhaps, yeah, that term is right, rather than thinking about it in terms of cosmopolitanism. So,
it also seems to me that what's happening with the use of Shah Waliullah is this kind of repackaging of Shah Waliullah as this anti-colonial thinker, whereas there's really no evidence for that in his actual work. So, I mean, this is kind of a later construction, partly his son, because his son issues that very famous fatwa, and then the later school. So those who then start describing themselves in the 20th century as being of the Shah Waliullah school are seeing themselves in that way, that they are, religious intellectuals who are committed to this kind of anti-colonial struggle, and that's what becomes different. Whereas, as I said, I don't think there's really any serious evidence Shah Waliullah was interested in that, and his own kind of theological, mystical writings are far more abstract than the sort of stuff that most of these other figures would be really dealing with. You know, you're not going to be, you know, preaching to like urban and rural kind of workers on, you know, like the Hamat or the Lamat of Shaulia, because no one will have a clue what the hell you're talking about. Really
well, of course, I mean, it's ahistorical to imagine such a thing because, I mean, it would have been impossible even for the British to recognize, right, what in fact was coming into existence at that time. It's only, you know, from retrospect, and it's a projection of indigeneity onto, you know, limiting, which is precisely what BHASHANI is not, is being a cosmologicalist or an internationalist. He is not an indigenist, which is what nationalism has reduced all politics to indigenism.
I mean, I think you're right about the repackaging of Shawalil, and I mean, and we see this constantly, right? Whether, I mean, BHASHANI himself is being repackaged, and it's also, I mean, it's, and I think that's part of this, you know, this idea of hermeneutics. There's a sort of creative hermeneutics happening, whether with happening, and I think it's happening within the framework of Sub-Sabbulsan Islam. This is where, you know, where you hear about Shah Waliullah in a different way, where you hear about God in a different way, where you hear about sort of, or where you're thinking about the Baya in a different way, right? It's there's that sort of, we're looking for where the more creative explorations of Islam is happening, and this is what I'm trying to sort of was trying to get to with the work. It's within the framework of a working class or a subaltern Islam, whereas when it comes to thinking about elite Islam, it becomes a much more scriptural or a textual sort of based sort of understanding, and perhaps a much more legal sort of juridical sort of understanding of Islam, perhaps. So yeah, but yeah.
Well, Sajjad, of course, this is an incredible conversation, and we could go on for a long time. I still have questions, but we've gone about half an hour over. So, Sajjad, would you like to close the session?
Yeah, because there are a couple of other questions, but they're a bit more difficult to kind of get a grip on what exactly they're asking. At least it's not entirely clear to me what exactly they're asking. Yeah, I mean, obviously we could continue on this for a while, and we look forward to the book version of the dissertation and the other work that you're doing. And I know, of course, you were curating a bunch of conversations with others on
There's more to follow.
Exactly, that's really interesting, because for me the connections are really interesting. I mean, one connection which immediately came to mind was someone like Sayyid Mahmoud al-Ighani in Iran.
Yes.
Who was, you know, famously known as the Red Ayatollah. And I remember a friend of mine who was a Marxist student just before and just after the revolution and was in jail. I remember him telling me that the only mullah he ever liked was Talibani, because he spoke his language, right? And his book, you know, Islam and, I guess it's called Ownership? Yeah, Islam and Ownership, Malikiyat, is a really interesting text. Because it tries to deal with, you know, some of these kind of issues of the rural poor and the so
I mean, BHASHANI himself is being equated to Ayatollah Kashani. I mean, which is quite interesting, and I mean, I don't.
That's a stranger kind of connection.
That's a stranger kind of connection.
Yes.
And then, I mean, perhaps as well as the Pakistani Dean of Canterbury, which is another stranger connection. But I hear what you're saying on Ayatollah Talibani.
And I'm sure there are other examples in other parts of the Muslim world. And certainly, I mean, the use of the term Islamic socialism, I mean, you have, what is it? In Iran, they established the first, it's called the Association of God-Fearing Socialists. Back in 1940, which
So this is the father of Ali Shariati.
Muhammad Ali Shariati was involved in that.
Yes.
So yeah, there are lots of kind of other interesting connections, and I guess you know, I think my last comment, and you can comment on if you will or not, as we finish is, what you raised as well. Where is subaltern Islam today, right? If we assume, in a sense, Islamic socialism cannot really be what it might have been, at the very least, we can certainly ask this question of what subaltern Islam is and what its relationship to power is. So, any final kind of
on that note? That's a tough question.
Yeah, of course, it's a tough question. It's a big question, anyways.
I think it's an important question. This idea of this idea of political thought as being something where we've sequestered it to a certain constituency, a certain group, and thinking, and we simply look at ideas of circulation, right? Ideas circulate from one group to another, usually from the elite to the subaltern, but we don't think about how ideas are germinating or and how Islamic political thought is being created within those spaces. And I think that's important to do. I mean, one of the most interesting things for me has been really how the figure of Abu Zar al-Ghifari circulates within, at least this is the new kind of work that circulates within a working class Islam. There's a familiarity with that figure than any other sort of than other figures, and sort of so yeah. I mean, I think where is subaltern Islam is an important question. I don't really have the answer to that, but I think it's a great one to answer.
I think it's probably a question we might come back to later as well.
Yeah.
So I guess all that's left is for us to thank you, of course, for your wonderful talk, which has raised lots of issues and questions. I'm sure we will continue in the chat in future. This was our final talk of this term. As I said, we will be resuming in the middle of January. Just watch out for the program. The second term, at least January to April, the program is already set, and from April to June, it's being finalized. So I hope we will have plenty of more conversations. And as Nauman and I have kind of been thinking out loud, it would be wonderful if we can actually bring everyone together once we can, maybe at the end of the year or later, so that we can actually have a proper conference and a proper actual exchange on what we think we've come up with through these conversations. And it would be lovely to have you, of course, as part of that conversation. So thank you for everyone who's been watching this term. Please do come back for more in January. And I guess the last thing is to say, everyone have a wonderful break. If you have a break, do have a nice break. Let's hope that the new year will bring something which will be fruitful and nourishing for us, and certainly healing as well in the new year. So I hope to see you all in the new year. So it's bye from me and adab from Nauman. Okay, thank you.